AI is going to be like climate change. A planet-scale shift that will change the conditions of how we humans go to work, do politics, and exist, or not, as the most complex and powerful beings in the world. Most grandly of all, it names the moment at which we move from being the users of tools to being secondary to those tools themselves. There are many reasons for skepticism, of course. Current iterations are often, frankly, a bit crap, but are rapidly improving. There is a seemingly relentless cycle of unfulfilled promises. And there are many other ways that AI is already tied up in climate change. It takes an absolutely enormous amount of water and energy to train and run. Enough that we might even summarise the current trajectory of AI development as a plan to boil the earth so that capitalism can finally replace all its pesky workers with perfectly reliable machines. This is something my guest this week might call an example of lift. That guest is Marek Poliks. He's an artist, composer, theorist, and host of the Disintegrator podcast, where you can listen to the most sophisticated conversations about AI going. I'm Richard Hames, and on this week's Novara FM, I spoke to Marek about the brave new futures AI is bringing about. From the catastrophic, to the utopic, to the head-slappingly moronic. Marek Poliks, welcome to Novara FM.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So, in a sense, AI has transformed, for those people who are very keen to believe in it, AI has transformed our sense of history, our sense of our place in history, our sense of our location in relation to everything. Are we perhaps the last humans about to be replaced by some sort of robot overlord or a collection of infrastructures that come to massively exceed us in cognitive power and scale? Or are we still in normal time, right? Are we still sort of in the everyday humdrum history where the 20th century still matters and so on? And I want to kind of approach that question in a whole bunch of different ways through thinking about a whole bunch of different histories. And the first one is to just think about AI and data, right? So in some ways, the most concrete, most technical question, which is that the big AI labs, OpenAI, who make ChatGPT, Google, of course, who make Gemini, Meta, who are involved in this thing called Llama, which is more open source, but still they're involved very heavily.
Ish, yeah.
Those people have already scraped the entire internet, right? They've already ingested all the publicly available data.
Right.
Where next?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Okay, a whole bunch of different questions there. I love the where next question. Maybe that's a good place to start. Someone that we had on our own podcast, Disintegrator, relatively recently was the artist Rafik Anadol, who is a major player, right? Like unbelievably important person in not just, AI, but specifically like the way that AI is being communicated to the public. He's an amazing spokesperson for AI in a lot of senses. Unbelievably gifted speaker and unbelievably gifted advocate for AI as a, let's say, large-scale phenomenon that has, as you say, already kind of consumed everything. And when he came on the pod, he said something which I like to kind of torture things and invert them in my own brain. And he started to talk about a new project that he kicked off earlier this year, which is the large nature model, where essentially he's working with a lot of NGOs and a lot of strict government organizations as well to start to look elsewhere. So actually looking into environmental data, I think the first major project was with the Amazon rainforest, like gathering all kinds of information about, let's say, cataloging plants and their kind of visual characteristics, cataloging sounds, all of that information, further kind of driving it extractively here, as always, into this moreness, this adding more to the total pile or the total archive. And as I listened to him, I was like, yeah, exactly. We're out. Like we've tapped everything, and we're already kind of looking to the next thing, which is, I guess, everything that we've kind of been so far unable to absorb into the total archive, mostly because of, some straight up like basic reasons, and that like we just haven't collected all of that information in a sort of form that's easily registrable in an archival kind of format. So I do see like the next wave of AI, and this is probably something that we'll talk about a lot, but I do see the next wave of AI being something that's very, very much connected to the Internet of Things, the world of sensors, the kind of small deployable objects out there that are, directly connected to the Earth or to the biosphere in some way, in order to continue that accumulative process. And obviously, there's some diminishing returns here because we were able to, not only document the entire kind of history of the world into the internet, obviously a very kind of partial history of the world into the internet within, let's say, 40 years. So now the kind of the non kind of anthropogenic world, or the non kind of English language anthropogenic world, I think is something that we could probably assimilate into our archive even faster. So that's definitely a where next. It's like a small step where next, but I feel like if you're interested in the future of or in the near future of AI, especially as a kind of extractive practice that's looking to assume more things into some kind of catalog, that's definitely a place to look. And for what it's worth, I'm not critical of that methodology. Like I'm actually, there's all kinds of lines of flight here that are really nice. Like we should be, de-anthropocentrizing AI, right? We should be looking to nature. We should be incorporating natural intelligence, to use Tika Brain's terminology, into the way that, this simulation of the world sees the world. Fair enough. To quote Benjamin Bratton, and again to very much torture a phrase that he used, he was talking about the principle of alignment and the problems of censorship, and exactly the issue that the archive that we've assembled is something that is extremely incomplete. Yes, we've scraped the internet, but we've subjected it to highly, highly enculturated, highly restrictive, highly kind of politically injected filters onto what that kind of world is. For Benjamin Bratton, like he sees alignment projects as necessarily limiting to the scope of this project called artificial intelligence. And at one point he said the phrase, which I really quite like, we have to put it all in, all of it. And so you can hear, again, this is someone who, well, certainly is not on the, let's say, the left side of the nature AI, bring in the natural, or bring in the non-anthropocentric. This is someone who is, maybe on the other side of that domain, who is also kind of arguing for the continuation of this extractive practice for what is essentially, it comes from a kind of similar value chain as we need to de-anthropocentrize AI people. He's saying, like, we need to make AI like kind of more locally racist so that it more kind of better understands the actual encoded racism of the world, right? If we have this like highly kind of censored, highly curated, highly kind of ideologically scoped archive that we're working from and that we allow it to kind of operate with, then we are therefore hiding all of the kind of, shadow, problematic, gray area or outright evil contexts that are still there but aren't expressed so directly. And so in hiding it, they become more buried, they become less easily assignable as such, less easily visible, and create further problems for ourselves. So there's another kind of dark forest there that I think could probably be pointed to as well. First is the we scraped the internet, but we basically scraped the English internet, right? So there's definitely a massive, addition to that archive that needs to happen in terms of language. And then in terms of, let's say, dark political content or dark content in general that is not necessarily in alignment with Silicon Valley ideology or, let's say, vaguely left, but obviously from the perspective, I think, of every listener here, like staunchly right political ideology that, those corporations use to make filtration decisions. And then there is, of course, the natural world. So yes, we extracted everything. There's still more to extract. Diminishing returns on extraction probably not the way forward. But that's so. Is that a reasonable answer to 1/10 of your question?
No, that's great. And this idea of a large nature model is a sort of an update to the idea that to the thing we are currently using in the sort of what are called foundation models, these huge models that people will be familiar with in the audience, which are called large language models, right? So just taking out language and replacing it with nature. I, for one, am very happy to see the back of language philosophy and the final proof that language is not all you need, and certainly not all that humans are doing, as the sort of the hobbled quality of those models, I think suggests.
I agree with you. Obviously, we're very prone to see, or let's say the current AI community is very prone to see language as the world, right? In that we are constructing all of this stuff based on fundamentally language. Happy to go into that in more detail if that's something that the audience wants to hear about. But really, like the underlying structure of the tools that we are using. The transformer, which is a specific technology that was developed at the end of the 2010s, that has been refined to a certain extent, but for the most part remains kind of intact in the large supermodels that we have, like GPT-4, for example. That architecture is built on essentially the kind of syntactic flow of language. So the way that it essentially works is by, God, do I want to do this live?
You do. Yeah, absolutely. You want to tell us how the transformer works?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, essentially the way that it works, I think the most critical innovation that it brought to the field is that prior to that particular point in time, the types of deep learning models that we were working with were good at doing things like, identifying, let's say, a handwritten character or handwritten number or something like that. They were able to do that for.
Yeah, so you have like a character and you're trying to work out if it's an F or an H or a P, that kind of task, right?
Yeah, and we could do that, I think, 60 years ago, like pretty reasonably. But we've been stuck in a holding pattern for a long time because these particular models were really struggling to deal with time, specifically with sequence. And language has, or one can say, we have made kind of collectively a decision that language and time are really kind of fundamentally related. That language actually consists not in an array of meanings that are, let's say, the word dog is related to the word cat and the word wolf is related to the word dog, and you can kind of put these all in a giant graph, essentially, which is one major part of what a large language model does. But actually that the sequential position of these words, the context of these words, really matters. And it seems like we have proven that out, that what the transformer does is essentially provides a instrument, which is called attention, not that you really need to know that, but it provides an instrument for which one can essentially store context and work forward to assemble something like a sentence. So before, large language models were very much able to kind of think in kind of, let's say, individual blobs, and now they can think in terms of sequences. And in so doing, major things happened. And so I want to return to your point, which is that you were happy to see a proof positive that language isn't everything. But what's interesting is that once we made this assertion about language as being a kind of like necessarily some kind of relationship between a constellation of meanings and sequence, and we built an architecture in order to do that. For whatever reason, that architecture is really good at doing other things, like, let's say, writing code to make a robot move or something like that, or doing microbiology. And that's where things start to get like really kind of freaky and eerie, right? And that language, the kind of structure that we have built on top of language through this principle that's called multimodality tends to, for whatever reason, be really applicable to a lot of other things. So I'm not objecting to that point because I also do agree that language isn't everything, and that's Richard. Like I could talk to you for like 6 hours. Like the problem with this conversation is like I want to have a comma and then like talk for like 5,000 other words and then kind of come back. But so yes, language isn't everything, but language is definitely quite potent or fertile or interesting as a vehicle to understand the world in a way that I think we're only now just realizing. And major credit to Benjamin Bratton for a lot of this particular insight.
You mentioned Benjamin Bratton there, and he's one of the guests you've had on the podcast that you make, Disintegrator, which I recommend everyone go and listen to, even if you are AI skeptical, perhaps even because, or definitely when you are AI skeptical. I really recommend particularly actually the Benjamin Bratton episode, although lots of them are fantastic. Give us a sense of what the sort of variety of thought is in this field, which we might call something like critical AI studies. I don't know if it has like a proper name that it's decided for itself. But what is the sort of variation or the distribution of opinion? And how do those sit in relation to what we might think of as the real sort of central power of AI, which is held by people like Sam Altman at OpenAI and the bunch of Microsoft executives who decide where the funding goes and so on. And this kind of, in some ways, center ground of AI research now. How do these two things relate? You mentioned already the key issue of alignment. Maybe you could just explain what that is and how these different thinkers think about that particular thing.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, to this particular audience, I would think of alignment as ensuring that the tool that we're trying to construct has some degree of, let's say, ideological or political or overlap, right? Like it really is kind of overlap. It is doing things that we want it to do. That is both in terms of like raw intention, like we want X plus Y to equal Z, but further that it conforms to like some really kind of embedded normative assertions about like what is okay, right? So that's really kind of a core kind of concept there. When thinking about the general field of, let's say, critical AI studies, or I would say like a more kind of informal group, of which I definitely am myself, of people who have some industry experience or not industry experience, people who have some experience with the technology or not some experience with the technology, but are, let's say, connected to the humanities and are therefore kind of freewheelingly imparting opinions about AI. We kind of have collected all into a little bit of a band, which is, I would say, an unbelievably irrelevant band to the group that you described, like a just mind-blowingly irrelevant band to that particular group, mostly because this group tends to be wrong about a lot of things and like really kind of fundamental things. And so maybe I'll start with one thing, and this is like something that we tend to talk a lot about with respect to AI, which is an obsession with like really kind of basic post-Enlightenment philosophy. Is an AI, like, is it a subject now? Is it an object? Or is it capable of creativity? My least favorite word maybe of all time. Like, is it capable of real creativity? Is it capable of doing something, that is completely new? Is it like all of these kind of like really abstract ways of thinking about AI that I find to be really kind of counterproductive. And I strongly recommend, if you want to read anything about this from that's sharing my perspective, that this kind of stuff is a little bit fluffy, Keith Tilford's chapter in my book with Roberto Alonso Trio in Choreomata is amazing. It's like one of my favorite pieces of writing I've read recently, in that it just absolutely excoriates this group for spending so much time thinking about these kind of transcendental words and assigning them to AI and getting themselves into all kinds of fervor about it. This is where people spend a lot of time talking. There is so much time and so much time wasted spent talking about like, is this thing like a person or not? Is it capable of human level XYZ or not? I think fundamentally it doesn't matter. These are like the wrong words, these like old school philosophical words. Again, I'm definitely parroting Benjamin Bratton here, but he's had like a major amount of influence on my thought. And so that's one thing that I wish this community would do less, especially on the creativity side. I would love to like never, ever talk about whether AI can be creative again, because it doesn't matter. Like it really doesn't matter. The other side of that, I think another thing that this particular group likes to kind of circulate about endlessly is they have, let's say, some like real misunderstandings of the labor dynamics within AI. First of all, there is this obviously very legitimate, I think, fear, or maybe I would rather say sudden uncomfortable awareness that everything one has done online is somehow both unbelievably permanent and, of course, like also unbelievably impermanent in the same way. But like people are starting to realize that we have been contributing to a kind of total archive for quite a long time, and one might say that total archive is history. But like people all of a sudden seem to be really surprised that there is some kind of historical record of, let's say, artistic work or non-artistic work, like scholarly work that is absorbed in some kind of, let's say, dark space online and stored in PDF format or text format or whatever that's contributing to this massive archive. And this includes music as well, of course, or any other kind of real production in general. there is this moment of uncomfortable, surprised awareness, I think, especially in the artistic community, that this stuff is a resource. And an unbelievable irony, given that and again, I tend to be kind of wacky about history, but let's just say the last 100 years of creative activity, if not all of creative activity throughout human history, is very much one about engaging with a archive and contributing to a kind of shared codex. That's like one of the most beautiful things about making art. Like I really that is something that I love about art, is that it is engaged in that. Obviously, at some point within the 20th century, and one could even say that this is something that happened at some point during the 18th century, or maybe even earlier. I don't think it necessarily matters, but one could say that there has been a moment of inflection, especially in the West, where art became very much about the radical expression of individual subjectivity as opposed to the contribution to some kind of traditional codex or traditional archive. Which is maybe inflected by moments of like, wow, really sick individual doing something really cool, and they become kind of memorialized, but is altogether very much about the relationship between that individual and that particular growing archive. That is like a recent thing, I think, or whether or not it's recent, I don't think matters, but it's an artificial thing. Let me just say it that way. Like that is definitely a thing that the Western art world has been artificially obsessed with for some period of time, and now we're all kind of realizing, whoa, actually, all of this stuff has been kind of glued together in this into this archive, and is a resource that's available not just to, let's say, other artists for remixing and resampling and resynthesizing or whatever, but of course also to incredibly large technology companies that are accessing that information and making like real world determinations based on its content. So like those are two things that like tend to really frustrate me in the critical AI community. There's like a fear about, is this thing a subject? Is this thing a god? Does this thing have a soul? Whatever. And then there's the like, is this thing storing my work in a way that makes me uncomfortable? And that raises. I'm happy to talk more about the labor dynamics here, but there is a whole kind of other labor universe here that I feel is something that, especially the kind of classic like Marx-pilled community, which definitely needs a refresh. I'm definitely like very much aligned with that school in a lot of senses, but also I'm very, very, very critical of its application to the present day. I think like both of those universes need a little bit of an education as far as not only what's actually happening in AI, but also just like recent history, I guess. Yeah.
I like the idea of no longer calling ourselves Marxists, but instead the Marx-pilled community.
Marx-pilled, yeah. He's hot, he's cool, yeah. Yeah.
And this is something about the question of art making and so on that you have firsthand experience of, because in addition to all your other work and theory and so on, you are a composer. Welcome to the composer turned theorist gang.
You've outed me.
I think it's maybe just you and me, but like maybe there are some other people as well.
Come join us. Don't be a composer anymore. Come on, it's way better over here.
You just ultimately get to the point where you realize that what you need to do is not just write increasingly long descriptions of your art, but just write the description and not bother with the art, and that's ultimately the way through. Talk to us concretely about like what it means to engage with a model as a medium for artistic work. Give me a sort of step-by-step guide. Like if I was going to make work, so I think one thing that people find very confusing about this is because when they have an image of an artist, lots of people will have an image of someone with like, paint and so on. And that seems like it's a clear kind of process. And then there's people who perhaps more familiar with things like contemporary art, who will think about the kinds of archival research and the kind of conceptual engineering that goes into lots of contemporary art. And that also seems, I think, quite dubious to lots of people, but nevertheless will seem like a sort of comprehensible workflow. So like concretely, when you are making music or like you are engaging with a music-based model, what would you actually physically do? What do I do? Like where do I go online? What do I click? That kind of level.
I would love to put it this way. I was lucky enough to have a conversation with, let's say, a senior technical executive at Modular AI, who is the group that designed the Mojo programming language, which is a very interesting like subclass of Python that does like all kinds of low-level stuff. It's really good for AI. And at one point we were talking about AI kind of generally, and he looked at me and he was like, I feel like you don't know what AI is. AI is this. AI is literally like NVIDIA, CUDA, like that stack, plus TensorFlow or PyTorch, which are two kind of massive Python libraries. To even call them a library feels incorrect. Python tool sets, and some kind of marketplace of models, like Hugging Face being not only the most popular, but really like by far the most dominant. And that's what AI is. And like, to me, that's like an amazing like boom. Like, that is like, if we want to talk about AI as like a real thing, like to put on our Marx pilled caps, like if we want to get into some kind of real kind of material determination of AI, it's like those three stacks cobbled together in some way. And like, if you were an artist that's working with AI, you basically have, let's say there's three kind of classes of artists working with AI. The first is an artist who's like encountered, let's say, ChatGPT for the first time and is essentially kind of constructing some sort of diary that represents that experience and is like, not interesting, pass, move on. The second, I think, is an artist who is working with that stack, the stack of some kind of computers running NVIDIA GPUs that are, let's say, working with this particular group of Python-based tools, and that are largely taking pre-existing models, for the most part, that are traded on this massive marketplace called Hugging Face, and using that to do things. So those models, for the most part, already exist, and rather what one is doing is fine-tuning those models, essentially adding an additional kind of layer of refinement on top of them. They have, let's say, if you look at let's say if we go to music, let's say we've trained, let's say we find a model that's been trained on a corpus of human singers and like has all kinds of, things that it can inference about what human singing is, and then is, in this case, like finally trained on an individual human singer or an individual group of human singers. Like, that's kind of the last mile that happens that this artist tends to work with. And what's interesting is that at this moment, there's like this whole satellite economy of people who are like kind of engineers that work with artists for the most part. And I feel like really something I'm kind of excited about is like this, dressed in black, like super mysterious artist person now always has like some techwear nerd like sitting next to them in the course of an exhibition, who's like actually the one who does the material labor of putting all of those things together and essentially uses the artist for essentially like the conceptual interface. And that's fine. Like, I think it's cool. I think it's great, actually. I think we need like a deeper penetration of real technical people into the art world. I think it's really important, because then we'll stop having conversations about being and creativity or whatever, because these things will be more technologically situated. So that's maybe the second class. And then the third class, and this is where things start to get a little, let's say, gnarly, are people like, for example, Rafik Anadol, people who are able to actually train models, like they're actually able to really instantiate models from scratch. And this is cool. Like, this to me is like real work, and that it's actually really engaging with the material media of let's say, artificial intelligence or deep learning, whatever word you want to use. But it requires a lot of resources. Obviously, you can train your own quote unquote models from scratch, or design your own model architectures from scratch with relatively few resources. But in order to really kind of do it at some pretty impressive scale, you need a lot of data, and therefore you need a lot of compute, and you need a lot of resources. So that creates this kind of third tier, which to me is by and large creating a lot of interesting work, but that work is complex.
So what I want to try and do now is sort of put AI not into the history of the subject and so on, to use those sort of philosophical terms that you were describing earlier, but to try and think about it as a kind of semi-autonomous infrastructure that will come to scaffold or organize or sort of be there in the background of daily life as we, for the rest of historical time, right? Can you sketch something of that for me? And I want to try again, although we're of course now talking about things that are happening in the future. The future is notoriously a bit abstract. Try and get relatively concrete here. And the reason why is because I want to try and pull back against some of the more sci-fi accelerative AI talk that we, I think, are now pretty quite familiar with, which is things like AI risk, which is that AI will sort of instantaneously one day kill everyone, right? Because an agent will emerge inside AI that will decide that humans are sort of pesky in the way, and so it doesn't need them anymore. So it'll just do something devious that we won't even be able to predict, and that will cause the end of the human race. And this is quite seriously suggested by people who are in that sort of AI risk field, that the plausibility of that is not zero. But I think there are other much more plausible futures for us to be thinking about. So what might it look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, whatever you think the time frame is? What might it look like to have this kind of mundane interaction with a semi-autonomous cognitive infrastructure powered by machine learning?
Yeah, I think one great example that gets trotted out frequently, I think there was a recent episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I think that I would strongly recommend here, where Dennis really has quite a freak out as he's forced to engage with what are essentially kind of avatars of artificial intelligence in the real world in the form of salespeople or, let's say, service people working at let's say a restaurant or a car rental company who have like absolutely zero agency or autonomy and are essentially kind of functioning as avatars of an application. Call whatever credit card company that you use and ask for a new card, which is an experience that I had yesterday. Spend 45 minutes on the phone trying to express desperately the desire to speak to a human being as opposed to a thing that can understand you just enough to be annoying. And I think the point here, as someone who like actually has, I would say like real kind of professional experience, like when it comes to building something like, let's say a support agent in order to, let's say handle a customer service request or a technical support request, is like that work, the work of technical support, there is a major assumption that is made that most people want to kind of like solve a problem themselves and therefore, find the answer themselves by kind of going through a catalog or using some kind of search function or speak with a live kind of simulated chat object. But obviously, like the real kind of the reason for all of this is that we don't really want to pay people to provide this particular function. Like we don't want to pay people to essentially answer the same question 1,000 times every day. The way that a lot of like, let's say customer service or technical support works is you kind of look at what questions are most commonly asked, and you tend to kind of build an interface that's designed to, let's say, minimize the amount of support staff that you have or service staff that you have by offloading that kind of regular cascade of common questions to some kind of automated function. The problem is that usually there's a reason that question is frequently asked, and it has more to do with the actual kind of architecture of the software object that you're working in or the cafe that you're serving people at or whatever, that is like, it's kind of inbuilt and it's too costly to actually fix in some way. So the experience that you have is of essentially working with a automated agent that's essentially designed to kind of defer your attention sufficiently and introduce enough what's called friction in order for you to stop communicating. The real kind of objection here is to get you to kind of stop consuming resources by presenting enough of a kind of brick wall in front of you. It's definitely a very common experience, especially maybe in the United States, but I don't know, elsewhere when dealing with things like healthcare, for example, is you have a lot of standardized questions, you have a fundamentally just absolutely defunct system in every possible regard, and there's really nothing that one can do apart from generate sufficient friction in order to prevent a customer support staff from being totally overwhelmed by the same complaint over and over again, and that complaint fundamentally being this thing is broken. And so what you get is this entire kind of tier of people who are, let's say, customer facing, working in the world, like talking to customers that are trying to engage, let's say, with a health insurance claim or something like that, who are like fundamentally disempowered in a really kind of complex way. Their own interfaces upstream into their organization have also been automated in this particular way, and they are ultimately on their way to being kind of automated into essentially just a friction generating object. So you get this like incredibly kind of weird or uncanny pullback or invisibility of the actual organization itself, like a major healthcare insurance provider, from its accessibility to the human world, and instead you have this like completely anagential swarm of agents who can be AI agents or can be human agents, but are all kind of, their function has much more to do with providing friction and providing the kind of obfuscation of access to the actual organization itself than anything else. So like so to go back to your question, which is a great one, like what does that look like in 5 years? Like I mean, to me, it's that entire swarm has just entirely been replaced by AI agents who are maybe better at understanding what it is that you're trying to say to them. But at the end of the day, like their function is essentially to defer your ability to speak to a structural problem or something like that. So I can imagine that things will actually get more frustrating in that particular regard. That is like a really, like, I know it's like kind of a mundane example, but you asked me to provide a mundane example. Like, that is like what a real AI relationship looks like at the moment, is like, yeah, call American Express on the phone. That's way more indicative of what will happen than, going to MoMA or talking to ChatGPT.
I'm having the very rare experience of being grateful for living in the UK.
Nice.
Where of course we don't have to deal with health insurance, and there is also the Monzo. You can just get a card, 2 taps. Anyway,
wow, nice.
That's great. That's a really punishing view of what the development of these tools might be, and it relates to something that you describe in another part of your work. It's sort of related as lift, and I'm wondering if we could sort of jump forward from where I was expecting to be at this point in the conversation towards this concept. And if you could describe for us what you mean by lift, because in some ways I think it's a bit of a controversial notion of how value is produced, at least for us in the Marx Pill community, right? And so, like, what is lift? How does it function in the world around us? And what does it have to do with thinking about AI?
Yeah, so definitely would love to talk about this. I think like this is, I would love to talk to the Marx Pill community more, because I think that there's a real opportunity here for us to theoretically all kind of adjust the scope of what we're talking about to something that is a little bit more modern. I think like Shimshon Bickler, Jonathan Nitzan, Suhail Malik are all people that have from that tradition, I think all kind of loosely connected to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, and to some other kind of interesting people, like started to think about what financial capitalism is as, first, a thing that is relatively incompatible with a lot of the things that Marx writes about. Like the way that it thinks about value is actually like entirely opposite to the way that the Marx thinks about value, and I can talk about that in a second. The way that labor is situated in all of this is actually like incredibly unrecognizable to Marx in a lot of respects. And then they make another step, which I think is quite interesting. And this is the step that I really kind of drive in on, which is that this kind of financialized version of capitalism is actually really kind of more at the core of what Marx was attempting to describe. But the kind of, the historical situation that Marx was living in prevented that from fully kind of realizing itself. And a major part of that has to do with what is a dependency that capitalism tends to have, that it really wants to pull itself away from, which is that of like material resources and the material world in general. The material world, the physical world, the world of objects and people can only be a limiting factor to capitalism. There's no way in which that space can actually introduce additional accelerations or additional affordances to capitalism, because the way that capitalism essentially works, and obviously that's a very kind of funny thing to say to Marx Pill community, so indulge me a little bit for saying something that ridiculous, but definitely the way that we are alleging that capitalism works is through a process of abstraction. The initial process of abstraction being one very much aligned with that the Marx Pill community understands very well, which is that of the commodity form, right? So you have a thing that's in the world, and in order to absorb that thing into the virtual space of capitalism, it becomes an object of exchange and therefore becomes an abstraction. It becomes essentially a relative object that is fungible with dollar bills, right? That's first order phase transition is a really kind of important thing that actually has continued many orders up in the contemporary sort of configuration of capitalism. So to lift really looks to acknowledge this, let's say, allergy or aversion, or rather just functional limitation that capitalism has on material dependencies. And essentially the way that it works is, well, capitalism increasingly likes to wedge things between itself and those physical dependencies. I just recently stayed at the wonderful Hilton Hotel Group and became kind of a little bit aware of how, Hilton hotels actually function, which is that Hilton Hotels, the Hilton in general, that's not a company that is at all responsible for the administration of hotels, right? That is a company that is a massive financial instrument constructed over, a tremendous amount of mergers and acquisitions and financial partnerships and channel partnerships with other organizations that, turn points relationships into speculative investments, and from there kind of organically and recursively produce new capital. That's what the business is. The hotel component of that is something that is a material dependency, is a limiting factor, and necessarily kind of shunts the potentiality of that growth. So in order to actually kind of construct itself as a thing that is able to continue to grow kind of infinitely up this recursive chain of total abstract value production, what hotel companies tend to do is they tend to subcontract or construct satellite organizations or otherwise move the chain of responsibility of the kind of core, let's say, corporate administration farther and farther and farther away from the ground. And in the ground, you have this, as I was kind of mentioning, this totally categorically disempowered group of largely contract workers or workers who are working for some contracted organization that are not really directly connected to the host organization in any kind of clear, derivable path. So this movement up is what I call lift, that aversion to the actual kind of stakes or holding on the ground. And what's kind of left behind is a situation on the ground which doesn't look a lot like capitalism. And again, I'm coming from the United States, so feel free to index in everything I'm saying a kind of worst possible case scenario for the UK. But I think, candidly, you guys are. I'll see you guys soon.
No, that's not oh no, we are deep in the shit over here. But maybe that's not such a worry for me. We have no manufacturing base. We have no real global power. We just have financial services, right? That's the main British export. And so maybe that ties in quite neatly with what you're saying about lift here.
But at the same time, you have all these people, and there is some, however abstract, dependency that hotels do have on physical hotels. People need to actually be parts of organizations that have enterprise partnerships and massive, contractual relationships with hotels in order to actually justify the existence of this points capitalization structure. You do kind of need the hotels, though it's getting farther and farther away and a little bit more distant. And so what you have on the ground, and this is something that has been, I think of David Graeber, Cory Doctorow as other people that I hold in very high esteem, discussed at length, is you have something that looks much, much more like feudalism on the ground than capitalism. You have essentially a group of people that is only essentially, especially in the United States, bound to the local franchise instantiation of some kind of commercial instrument. And that's, they don't have any government or anything like that can do anything else for them. Snow Crash, right? Neil Stephenson. Snow Crash is a good example of a book that describes what the present day American universe looks like, which is this endless kind of array of micro franchises. Every neighborhood is essentially a kind of franchise organization with a sort of feudal lord that's associated with it, and some very kind of feudalistic dependencies on some upstream, larger scale commercial organizations. And that's what makes the kind of conventional Marx-pilled approach of saying capitalism bad, overthrow capitalism, focus on the total deconstruction of capitalism, kind of not particularly useful. First, because, what labor power does a 20th order contract employee at some instance of a franchise have with respect to the organization itself? Right? Apart from the optics of an organization, like in the case of Starbucks, for example, not much. It's much more a kind of theoretical play that's happening there.
When we're talking about lift, are we talking about a similar process that goes on when a machine learning model is trained on a collection of data and then produces a sort of a model of that data? Is there a homology there between these two different processes of moving from the sort of the concrete stuff, the inventory of capitalism, up to its sort of the most abstract forms of value? Is there a relationship there with the ways in which individual pieces of text, your artwork, this person's tweet, that post on Reddit, gets sucked up into this model that then spits out further text? So how does the abstraction that happens in a model relate to the abstraction you're saying is constitutive of contemporary capitalism?
This is immediately realized in, let's say, first and maybe kind of most crudely in the context of the embedding, right? And the embedding is the operating space of a deep learning model where you essentially take something like a total archive or some web scraped thing or some data set and encode it into a multidimensional array of relationships between nodes or points. So again, superficially, dog and wolf are positions within a a very, very large and hyperdimensional graph. And dog and wolf may be sort of co-related or share certain dimensional characteristics that cat does not. And maybe the three of them share certain dimensional characteristics that, I don't know, a word like church has, right? So in order to actually kind of represent the world in the space of, let's say, a universe like ChatGPT or GPT-4, one has to, at first, take the entire world and place it into a space like this. You have to literally kind of re-represent the world as a hyper multidimensional array of embeddings. And this is like, it's not that this is a super low res thing, right? Like there's many dimensions here that are used to express a tremendous amount of nuance. And one could argue that there are so many dimensions that maybe that degree of nuance is even higher than something that we could even conceptualize as individual speakers of a given language. So that's one thing that I want to note. But that first order motion from, let's say, something as first order virtual as language into something that is strictly quantitative array of relationships is a kind of a meaningful gesture towards abstraction. And then the second component to this, and this is something that we talked about a little bit before, is this principle of the transformer to then situate context as a temporal relationship, which I don't think is necessarily true. Like, I think there's a lot of arguments that one can make that context is something that is a little bit more dimensionally rich than temporal associations. And obviously, a lot of context is pre-given in the association of things within an embedding, but there's a very kind of complex assertion, or a very kind of strong assertion that's made by saying that meaning is constructed through the sequential positioning of tokens. And so that's where things start to also get a little bit kind of interesting. They start to retreat a little bit from, let's say, the physical or the material, or the noumenal or whatever. Yeah,
it's like the sequential sequence of tokens is where meaning and context happens. I think I agree with you about the critique of that. But can you just say what a token is? Maybe that'd be like just yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, let's look at let's take the sentence, Richard Hames is handsome, right? That's a very, very kind of nice sentence.
Stop. Also, it's a podcast. I have a face for radio. This is why I'm doing this job and not in our other podcast downstream, which is filmed.
So, I mean, and you can watch this. Now, of course, ChatGPT is so fast now, it's almost disorientingly fast that you no longer necessarily see this kind of sequentialization play itself forward. But like, as an AI is processing as a large language model, let's put it more specifically, is processing this particular concept, or let's say receiving the prompt of Richard Hames is handsome, it is on the first order looking at 5 specific objects that are contained within a sequence, and is interpolating the meaning of each of those successive things based on their position. So Richard being the first word in the sentence and Hames being the second word of the sentence, having some significant meaning as it comes to the object of the sentence, which is the second part of that sentence. So yes, like, is that how a sentence works? Like, does a sentence usually work by, let's say, subject following object? Of course, this is being incredibly reductive about what an AI is actually doing. Yeah, for the most part, like that does tend to be how sentences are constructed. But that sequentialization is complicated. Like it makes an assertion about meaning that is something that we should understand as an assumption, as opposed to something that's necessarily factually derived.
In the last 2 weeks, there has been a new model from OpenAI that's come out. It's called 01 or O1. Actually, it's called O1, not as in Angelicism O1, but which is a reference to people who have listened to your podcast and indeed been about on the sillier parts of the internet for the last 5 years will recognize. Angelicism O1 is it's a blog. I'm just going to go with that. It's a blog. Yeah. But there's an OpenAI model called O1, which is embeds this kind of thing called chain of thought reasoning, right? That's been an innovation that's been around for a while, but this is the first model to, as far as I know,
actually apply it
in depth. And what that means is that it decides how long it's going to take to respond to you. And the way it does that is by thinking step by step. Can you just describe for us what that process is? And is that a kind of radicalization of this thing you were just saying about meaning being like sequential?
Yeah, so it COT or chain of thought, which is the kind of operating principle here, is essentially the next order application of this type of idea. And it makes essentially the assumption that one thinks things through as a, let's say, axiomatic sequence of nodes. So like, if I'm going to solve a math problem very superficially, and this is probably a good way to solve a math problem, I'm going to, let's say, follow a discrete number of steps, or maybe an indiscrete number of steps, but I will be proceeding stepwise as I move through the problem. Maybe first I will cancel out any things on either side of the equal sign that are cancelable. Maybe then I will subtract a component from the equation on one side and move it to the other side in order to isolate a variable, and then I'll solve the problem. So very kind of reasonable chain of events. However, I think that this type of sequentiality or sequenceness is, again, like a very kind of powerful or normative or complicated assumption about the way that problems exist within the world. Obviously, this is like a fundamental way that computation sort of proceeds. Like, computation proceeds axiomatically. It proceeds step by step. It is a fundamentally kind of serial process. And of course, you can parallelize computation all you want, but at the end of the day, you're operating asynchronously through a bunch of sequences that are moving themselves forward. There's a tremendous amount of sequentiality that's embedded within computation itself.
And a problem that is solvable step by step from a certain input to a given output is what is called in computer science an algorithm, right? That is simply what an algorithm is. And the innovation of machine learning is that you can get algorithms to write themselves, basically. And so now we have algorithms that wrote themselves, working out how to write further algorithms for their own thinking, and then delivering you answers based on sort of higher order abstractions of what meaning is like.
And the irony being here is that those questions that are maybe more easily answered asequentially or within a single step actually become kind of weird. Like, one is applying like a very kind of specific formal structure to thinking out a very kind of simple question, and then takes longer or produces kind of worse answers for what is called, complicatedly or not, common sense reasoning. So you get this kind of let's say, inverse ability to produce what are essentially common sense results, and you maybe get a little bit better. I think like the results here have been relatively mixed. Obviously, everyone was extremely excited about this, the release of this particular model. I think most people get the sense that it's good at doing complex math. It's not much better at doing particularly anything else, and it's quite cool to, quote, watch an artificial intelligence reason its way through a problem, but that's not really what's happening. It's more recursively prompting itself through a problem. And I think like the sense that I get here is that this is going to kind of continue to plateau on the utility of these tools into a kind of dialogical object. Like, in addition to being kind of worse at common sense reasoning, there is a doubling down, as we're kind of discussing, on the autoregressive process, which is essentially to take a thing and go from that thing and couple through itself and looking at its previous sequence to produce the next thing. So you're never couple steps ahead simultaneously. You're always looking immediately myopically at the next object. This is like such a core problem of computation that is what the entire mid-century of computation was all about. This problem of like always focusing on the next, as opposed to the knowability of the end of some computational process, or the ability to actually work many stages into the possible future. In so doing, in this continuation of this like myopic step-by-step motion, context, feed forward, move to the next step, context, move to the next step, context, move to the next step. You're doubling down on a particular kind of trait that, to me, is really much more about delivering on the promise of prompts and responses than it is about constructing something radically new in the surface of artificial intelligence. Instead, it's about making an agent more transparent, let's say, in its ability to provide a response to you, and also providing a little bit more efficacy when it comes to doing complicated things like math. Whether or not it has the ability to actually unlock what I think everyone is really excited about, which is the real ability of AI or foundational models like this to function as agents in the world, as like much more kind of complex, multidimensional things that have their own ability to engage with other media, to make their own decisions, to spin up their own kind of sub-processes, things like that. That doesn't seem like this is carrying us further in that direction. It rather feels like we are continuing to iterate on better and better and more transparent and more kind of dialogically friendly chatbots who get better and better at passing the imitation game or Turing test.
Let's go now to the most sort of substantial, in some ways, question of contemporary AI, which is the way in which it will become and has already become an object of geopolitics. Plus 972 Mag did a really exceptional expose of the way in which machine learning models have already been used by the Israeli military to decide on targets in Gaza. So when you are deciding on a target militarily, you have to have some sort of justification or reason for having that target, right? That is a matter of international law. That doesn't mean that the target is humane. It doesn't mean that it's good to bomb that particular thing, but it means that you must have some military reason. And the construction of a machine learning model that tells you where to bomb is probably, according to international law, enough of a threshold to allow that to pass, right? So there is a sense in which the responsibility for things like war crimes might ultimately be, even if you have a human commander still that says, yes, go, or don't go, right? The responsibility there might be offloaded to some extent onto an autonomous infrastructure of satellite imagery processed through machine learning algorithms, trained on what has been a previous target, which, as we know, were also previously incredibly destructive, and then justifying that process to a human targeter, which has allowed the IDF to massively speed up the selection of targets. Before, they used to have about 50 a year, so about one a week. Now they have like 4 a day. And so you've automated that process. That is an extremely grim process that's happening there. And I want to talk about sort of geopolitics a bit more widely as well. How do you see competition between the US and China playing into this? These are the two big data superpowers of the world. They're the two big compute superpowers, or at least they will be in 5-10 years. How do you see that dynamic playing out over the next sort of 10 years? What should we be watching out for?
Maybe just like first on the note about like AI is a justificatory apparatus for human targeting. Unbelievably interesting and sordid and upsetting in every possible sense. But also at the same time, these things tend to kind of emerge only after the actual apparatus that the justification is appealing to has started to sufficiently erode that it doesn't quite matter so much anymore. Like how relevant is international law to what's going on at the particular moment? I think is like a very, very big question, right? Like to what extent is international law being invoked in the the day-to-day occurrences? It's really, really, really hard to think that international law is being used as any kind of like local justificatory apparatus, or even externally, to be totally honest, in that like that entire apparatus, the efficacy of that apparatus has obviously completely fallen apart. And this is something really where I think kind of more lifted aspects of techno-capital tend to really kind of find themselves working really well. They tend to kind of go into spaces that have already been sufficiently destabilized or sufficiently kind of removed of all utility, and where the benchmark for acceptability has already passed all the way, to the ground. And they go there, like they provide some kind of value-added service there, which I find to be very interesting, and also like very upsetting. But that's like such a bureaucratic and mundane, in the grand scheme of things, application of AI, right? In that it is being used to justify slaughter. Really just brutal, execrable slaughter to an organization that doesn't have any power really, and isn't capable of really doing anything, from an organization that doesn't care. Like that to me is like a really kind of interesting confluence of forces for AI to arrive at. Obviously, it's also like in more kind of fanged and toothy sort of ways is obviously much better at actually delivering munitions to human bodies, and that's where things get really, really scary, as opposed to the justificatory thing. But that's what I find to be so interesting, is that the justificatory thing is like the object of discussion, because like that is super lifted AI, this like empty bureaucratic thing that's built over something that is so material and so so decoupled from that space, I guess. Sorry, yeah.
No, that's great. I mean, so let's turn to the sort of the US China thing, right? Because there is a particular paper people might have come across as, in some ways, just the latest iteration, I would say, of a very ecstatic form of writing that turns out to be strangely invested in some really quite mundane, or not mundane, but like really quite grimy power games. And that paper I'm referring to is called Situational Awareness. If you want to look it up online, it's called situational-awareness.ai. It's the URL where it's at. And it's this paper by this young wonderkind of the AI world called Leopold Aschenbrenner. Is that his name?
Yeah, beautifully pronounced. Yeah, Aschenbrenner.
Who is this hedge fund guy, used to work at FTX, turned OpenAI researcher. He quit under sort of in dramatic circumstances. Yeah. And then OpenAI have this process where if you say things about them they don't like after you've quit, then you forfeit the equity that you have in the company. So that you're paid, like many startups, in not exactly stock in OpenAI, because OpenAI is a kind of a weird legal construct, so it doesn't really have stock exactly, but you're paid in this kind of option that you can then cash out later, and you can become very, 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 very rich in the future if OpenAI goes very well. He decided to forfeit that in favor of speaking about what he thought was the dangerous culture of OpenAI's safety culture. He was part of, I think, the super alignment team, and then that decomposed. Super alignment being OpenAI's team trying to do what is called alignment, which we talked about earlier, which is getting the AI not to kill everyone, right? At its limit, getting everyone not to kill everyone.
Yeah, that's a much better definition than the one I provided, yeah.
But also making sure that it doesn't radically change the conditions of the planet in a way that makes it inhospitable for humans, and not in the way that we might think about that in terms of climate change, but much more like you decided to use every single atom on the Earth for something else.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of the way in which AI security or AI safety is often talked about at the limit. These expressed security and safety concerns about OpenAI in particular also have this other lens, which is geopolitical competition. And I wonder if we can talk about, like, how do you see those two layers fitting together? Like, is AI safety ringing the alarm bell, come and regulate us? Is that intertwined with this geopolitical competition? Is it entwined with attempt to force regulation so that the incumbents in the market can push out new startups? Like, what is going on with this, with the politics of it, but also with the material, basis of it? What do you think about AI risk?
Yeah, amazing question. I think maybe to add a third kind of leg to that particular stool, it's also a marketing tactic, right? Like fundamentally, the more kind of hysterical you write about this stuff, the more kind of discourse you generate, and then the more this kind of cottage industry of discourse and startups kind of develops and proliferates throughout the world. And yeah, that's definitely a valence to it as well. I think I'm thinking about there's an excellent piece that one of the most important kind of inspirations to my like philosophical journey, especially in computation, is the philosopher Reza Negarestani. And he wrote quite a piece, I think this is like a decade or so ago, essentially looking at the work of someone who, the kind of OG of this particular type of discourse, the CCRU co-leader Nick Land, who has, of course, started as someone with who was very Marx-pilled, maybe more Marx-pilled than anybody listening, who found his way to the absolute hard opposite of that, and in very much a way turned into like a real kind of advocate of Curtis Yarvin, techno-feudalists, hardcore accelerated capitalism. Very complicated individual who is very, very important when thinking about AI in a lot of respects, because he did a lot of the early work in theorizing that space. And so in Reza's piece, criticizing his work, Reza is really going after the idea of singularity, or the idea of this kind of hysterical AGI that's kind of posited by humans, that is somehow something that emerges from more compute, from more of the same. Like if you just do more of the same harder and faster with more kind of physical resources, you get to this thing, which is some kind of godlike, super powerful creature, or some kind of, total hyperbola. That's the word I was looking. Some hyperbola of technological development that is limitless, the singularity. And for Reza, and I think for a lot of people, like that terrain should be thought of as a kind of like religious relationship to AI. It's very, very speculative. It's totally not grounded in any kind of like real kind of empirical investigation. And it's rather something that has very much to do with like spiritual allegations of what AI is, as something that is greater than a human in some sort of like, metaphysical sense, or something that is kind of godlike, which is obviously an incredibly metaphysical allegation. What Reza points out, and what I think is really interesting, is that there is some ability of people to, if you are hysterical enough and kind of at scale, actually summon these sorts of situations into existence simply by saturating the discourse, saturating the space, and in this case, like saturating the actual kind of productive domain of these technologies with that type of hysteria. You can kind of make something like that happen because you are so directly injecting this kind of mystical, theological, metaphysical juice into that world. And that is very much at play, I think, in this particular article. And I definitely, like, if you are an AI doomer, which I think is a reasonable position to be, but you should be it shouldn't be an unchecked AI doomerism. If you really want to be a doomer on Silicon Valley and AI, read this article. It's like one of the most upsetting things I think I've ever read, in that essentially it works precisely as kind of Reza predicts a decade or so ago, in that it says AGI is inevitable. And it comes to the assumption that AGI is inevitable because AI continues to get better.
And the article you're referring to now, is the situational awareness paper by Leopold Aschenbrenner. Yeah. Not Reza Negrestani's article.
Yes. Yes. This paper starts with the idea that AGI is inevitable, right? Like that's the proposition. And in so doing, if AGI is inevitable, we have to control it. Like it has to be us that controls it, as opposed to China, as opposed to some kind of BRICS affiliation. It has to be, what does he call it? The name of this particular section is "The Free World Must Prevail." It has to be owned by the forces of quote unquote democracy, as some kind of loose affiliation of, I guess largely ethno-nationalistic. Yeah, NATO. Yeah. So it's I mean, already that kind of content in a paper like this from a former OpenAI employee is concerning. And what he essentially details is that because we're thinking about AGI as a thing that happens when you apply more resources to AI development, we should therefore look to the spaces in the world that are best at marshaling energy or marshaling resources, in that the more resources you have, the more compute you have, the greater intelligence you ultimately receive. Therefore, according to this chain of reasoning, China is best positioned to actually construct an AGI first, though he also launches into all kinds of, let's just put it blankly, racist tropes about Chinese culture and theft of intellectual property and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's a big part of what he's asserting, that they will get to AGI in part due to the co-application of theft and massive resource availability. And therefore, the ultimate kind of conclusion here is that the US military essentially needs to get directly, or the Western military, aka NATO, aka the US military, sorry guys, needs to get directly involved in the production of AGI.
Paul Nakasone is the former head of the NSA. And he joined, I think about a year ago now, OpenAI's board as a sort of advisor to OpenAI. So I think that process of getting serious from a military perspective, from a global hegemon perspective, about the potentials of AI is very much already there, right? It's already happening. In this rush to get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is the level at which an AI can broadly do whatever humans can do. Or indeed the rush to get to ASI, artificial superintelligence, which is the level at which an AI can do essentially what humans can collectively do, and therefore more so, transform the entire planet. There's been a sequence of papers that have had titles of the form, da-da-da is all you need. So you referenced one earlier. So attention is all you need, and then open-endedness is all you need, and then a whole bunch of other things, right? So there's always this one general fix. Yeah. One more general fix, right? It's almost like kind of Maoist in a sense, because with Maoism there's always like one more dialectic comrade, and then and then the whole thing will be complete. There's a sense of something always being just around the corner. And one thing that has emerged from this scene of just one more things is this thing called Solomonov theory of inductive inference. That sounds very complicated. It is very complicated. We're not going to go through that. But what it is, it's a formalization of Bayesianism. It's a computational formalization of Bayes' theorem. Now, Bayes' theorem is a way of deciding how to update your beliefs given new evidence. So you believe things about the world. They have certain probabilities. You believe that it's very likely that it will rain tomorrow, for example. Right? It's a very simple example. And then it doesn't rain tomorrow. The question is, how much do I update my belief that it would have rained tomorrow, given that it didn't rain tomorrow? Like, how much should I say, okay, what will happen next time? What will happen next time? What happens next time? And for certain people, for example, Ilya Zyutkowski, who is not Nick Land, but comes from only a few years after that, so he's a very formative influence over the AI safety thing. He's in some ways the loudest voice at the very extreme end of the AI safety discourse, which is to say, AI will kill everyone, basically. This sort of sci-fi plot in some ways that I narrated earlier about AIs waking up one day and deciding to kill everyone. This is a Yudkowsky story. For him, that is the single form of intelligence. Solomonov in theory of induction plus preferences. And this is a thought that I'm getting from Pete Wolfendale, who is a philosopher and who has recently turned his attention to AI, who I think is a really great thinker on this topic. What does it do to our notion of what it is to be a thinking thing, or what it is to be critical, or what it is to think meaningfully about the world, or to be in the world meaningfully, to undergo this process of like purification of what that thinking process is supposed to be, right? So we have this emergent sense that thinking is just this one thing. What does that change about the way in which we understand the human?
Yeah, great question. Maybe the place to start would be with Thomas Bayes, who and Laplace. Like, these are two people that I think are like really fundamental to the undergirding ideology here. Bayes, something that no one really talks about anymore, is like Bayes was a theologian. Like, this it's unbelievably kind of interesting vector to what it was that he was constructing. And I definitely recommend if you want to experience the underlying assertion of what you're describing on its most fundamental level, like just reading Pierre-Simon Laplace is like a really good thing to do, because that is a person who fundamentally believes that there is like a knowable and describable world in strictly quantifiable terms, which is like, I mean, these are the two people who are kind of most attributable to the history of kind of Bayesian thinking, at least historically.
Give us a very brief bio. Who are these people?
They're both mathematicians, right? Like, Bayes is coming from more of a kind of speculative place, essentially, and more of a kind of theological place. And Laplace is a strict mathematician who kind of wandered into philosophy. I would say that would be a good way to situate them. And this is coming from the 18th century and moving from there. So it's not a new idea, the kind of Bayesian concept. It's definitely something that's been around since the the Enlightenment, right? That's definitely a major kind of association. So, I mean, you said a lot of things that are really kind of poetic and I think really quite striking, in that like the idea of like there being this one more thing, this like immediate kind of short-sightedness with respect to the kind of local as opposed to the kind of more speculative future. Also very much relating to the kind of autoregressive problem of continuing to plot kind of one stage ahead, continuing to kind of feed forward into the next kind of immediate state, always thinking about the next state, the immediate next state, as opposed to the total field of possibility that is incurred by all possible states, right? That is like one kind of one thing that I'm taking from your comment, which I think is a nice kind of overlay. Attention is all you need, and the next word that ChatGPT is going to produce from Richard Hames is Richard Hames is handsome, right? So that's that's
it's extraordinary.
Yeah. But then the question that you raise is even more interesting, which is that you're describing an idea of intelligence, which is essentially something that is broadly convergent. It's an idea of intelligence that gradually, upon the consistent refinement of a series of assumptions over time, can crystallize towards something that is not, let's say, absolutely predictive, but very kind of viably predictive in almost all cases, and that every kind of successive moment is a recalibration of a model, a series of assumptions, towards some ultimately calibrated state. That is definitely a major component to this. And obviously, Bayesian thinking, there's no kind of assumption that the world's not dynamic. Like, there is an understanding that the world is dynamic, the world is changing. That's the whole reason for the kind of probabilistic component of all of this, that there is a chance that that it will rain tomorrow, and that one may make assumptions about maybe this actually will be quite a long rainstorm that will last an inordinately long time, albeit that is a low probability. So there is an assumption that the world is dynamic. The problem, though, to me, is this principle of convergence, of there being some kind of model that is ultimately absolutely realizable of a state of affairs. And this is something where, Pierre-Simon Laplace is like a especially kind of problematic inheritor, in that there is a world that is describable, which I think is a philosophical question, but one that has largely been decided by the philosophical community as no, right? I think that would be the first statement there. And then the next part of your question was what does this mean for the human, or the position of the human? And it's interesting how little we've talked about the human, over the course of this conversation, right? And that we've mostly been speaking about this external entity and its concept of intelligence, blah, 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 blah. But the human concept of intelligence is also something that is very much changing, very, very much changing locally. And you mentioned right at the beginning this obvious idea that all of technology essentially is let's say, the outsourcing of cognitive facility elsewhere to other things. I think one thing that I see happening very much now is that the human is very much, or let's say individual kind of threads within human activity or human activities are very much outsourceable objects to cognition happening elsewhere. That to me, I find to be very interesting. For example, in the kind of contemporary, highly, let's say, Western, highly digitized, highly kind of virtualized space that we're operating in, there are my phone has a tremendous amount of penetration into various parts of my brain at all times, and those parts of my brains are not synchronized. They're all kind of playing different games simultaneously. For example, my blood glucose level is a constant kind of object that is kind of gamified by an external system and kind of managed by an external system. And now here's where the kind of reversal happens. Instead of using a technology as a way to offload the way that my brain thinks about my blood glucose level, there are all these kind of beautiful software companies out there that are actually using my smartphone to use my blood glucose level as an instrument of cognition for the technology itself. The application of that kind of injection of, or let's say the application of that kind of outsourcing of individual, let's say, threads or components of my brain and body at scale tends actually towards, to some extent, the kind of diminution or the kind of, let's say, fractionalization of the human as a kind of thinking object. Because now my brain is doing a lot of kind of parallel processing towards other ends, as opposed to kind of functioning, let's say, in a more or less kind of agential way toward the accomplishments of its own ends. Not that that's ever not been the case, right? We have always been subordinated by power. That does seem to be a fundamental thing characteristic to human existence for the most part. However, the penetration and the just raw amount of parallel processing that we're doing, the different things that our brains are doing at all times, seems to be increasing by orders of magnitude. And that, I think, has implications.
One of the implications might be that there is a kind of new collection of arts of personhood that are emerging. So we haven't talked particularly about personhood or subjects and so on, but I do feel like there are new ways of being a person or new ways of experimenting with what it's like to be a person that are afforded by this new technological armature. And I wonder if you have any particular examples that you'd like to point to, particularly with regards to what you describe in your work as a vapor space. So there has been a transformation of the subject in the last, or our conception of the subject, that is historically begun with something like postmodernism, the proliferation of the subject into many, many data points, but which is obviously technically constructed through the production of mass data, big data as it was called 10 years ago, and that was the big buzzword. And then the reorganization of that big data into machine learning models, and then onto what we might think of as agentic AI. Where do you see opportunities for the art of personhood to be expanded in this new vapor space terrain?
Yeah, so I use the term vapor space to describe a kind of ambiguous state of being, which is essentially the question of like what happens when cognition is fully subcontracted, essentially. Like what happens when we become sort of more or less kind of sleepy objects that kind of passively watch the subcontraction of our various cognitive, physical, whatever faculties for the performance of tasks for external for computation. It's like super the matrix kind of thinking, albeit it's like 1,000 matrices that are all happening simultaneously, and they're all kind of random and stupid, and they don't make any sense, and they're not coordinated towards using the human as some kind of power battery, but rather just kind of arbitrary. They're just arbitrary systems that are used ultimately to fund financial instruments that are collecting on derivatives, right? Like it's the stupidest possible manifestation of the matrix world, in that there's absolutely no direction or intention behind any of this for the most part. Obviously, empire lurking in the shadows, but I always want to kind of cast a separation between these two entities because I don't think that they work necessarily always in concert. So what happens in vapor space? Like what possibility does exist there? Like what affordances for some kind of good things? I guess maybe something that I read in your question is like some kind of noto optimism. And like this is where, and again, maybe I return to my fist shaking at the art world. There is an amazing moment happening right now where we are actually, especially those of us who are part of the same kind of codex that's being kind of co-assembled through the processing of all of our data, kind of being commingled in a really kind of interesting way. All of our stuff is kind of shared together, and there are possibilities for some kinds of uncanny speculative solidarity between the way that we construct ourselves and other kind of loose, ambiguous shadow forms, floating through this shared codex. So a book that I really recommend anyone to read who's interested in understanding the present situation, not only in terms of technology, but also geopolitically, is Benjamin Bratton, his book, The Stack, which was I think it's from 2016 or maybe even earlier, but it's like a freaking beast. There's a section in there, and it's the section that I like the section that I like the most on the user. Like you can read it cynically as like the user is the thing that replaces the person, or the subject as some kind of agential node within a very kind of complex planetary scaling computing apparatus. And you could say, oh, human dead, sad, blah, blah, blah. But the user is also interesting in that it allows for this ability for multiple people or things or objects to kind of co-inhabit an avatar. And there, I think, is something that we're very much seeing right now with present day uses of the internet in more kind of, let's say, lefty spaces, the ability to actually really kind of covalently share anonymity together, that I think is really, really powerful, right? You can actually really kind of construct some very interesting assemblages of personhood together via this distribution of ourselves online, in that we are kind of stretched and smeared together throughout all these platforms. So definitely encourage reading that section, but like put your happy hat on or whatever, as opposed to your doomer hat, because I think that there's some possibilities.
Well, here's to being stretched and smeared together on the internet. Marek Poliks, thank you so much. This has been extremely, I hope, relaxing. I mean that sincerely. I think there are a lot of sort of subroutines that are run when people encounter the phrase AI. And I think part of what I've been trying to do here is get people to stop running those subroutines and start running the actual process of thinking about the object, you know? And I think you've been an exceptional guide to doing exactly that, actually. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.